So thank you, Alessandro, for this occasional presentation and this initiative, which is across diverse fields of research. And thank you for attention and good afternoon to everybody. Well, I was given this mission impossible to give in a single occasion to talk about economic policy, which is a very wide subject. I should rather use economic policies in plural, in the sense that we have diverse spheres of public intervention on economic activity. Well, we think in a first instance to the macro policy of monetary and fiscal management, but we have much other fields of public intervention in economic control, regulation, trade and capital flow control restrictions, price caps, price policies, industrial policies, regional policies, and last but not least, welfare policies. So I'll try only to sketch sundry reflection around this basic question: why state or state bodies should intervene in regulating, correcting, and supplementing the results of the economic activity as they come out from the choice and action of private agents on the market. Why it doesn't go down? Help. Okay. So we have this now more market, less state. That's the slogan of neoliberal and conservative opinion now and well in the past. Market is some kind of shorthand term for all economic exchange between private agents for consumption, investment, and wealth allocation purposes, and they acting solely upon the pursuit of individual utility and profit. State is institution established by political power and legislation with all network of administrative organization governing the society within a boundary of the state. More market, less state, but modern society are in fact mixed economies, market and state. State intervenes directly or indirectly in the provision of goods and services and is empowered by law normally to regulate the ranges and mode of operation of businesses. So we might think about some kind of ideal line between some kind of more extreme pure market and pure state rule of a society. And we have in the middle of old situations in modern society, but perhaps also in older historical examples. And I think extreme cases are rare. We have Millet, anarcho-capitalism or something like that. We'll see what comes out. Well, we had the radical realized socialism and experiment, but they left some room to receive your market for private exchange. And until the 1980s and 90s, there was some kind of understanding among scholars that there were variety of capitalism where possible. And there was a literature, a socio-economical literature on variety of capitalism. Soski's the Swedish one, I don't remember the name. So we had the discussion about the possibility between some kind of Anglo-Saxon liberal capitalism, German Rhenanian model of regulated social market capitalism, Scandinavian welfare, etc., etc. Neoliberals have gained prevalence since the 90s, in the last 2 decades. Well, what to say? Well, there is, frankly speaking, there is a great difference. I'm old enough to remember the past. How was Italy, but also England or France in the 90s, still in the 1960s and 1970s, after the immediate post-war years? Heavy industry, steel, mining, transport, bank, but also financial activity, banking, etc. Perhaps, surely in Italy, but also in England, held perhaps the majority of the shares of the operating companies. Then there's been the wave of liberalization, privatization of the Thatcherian, Reaganian period in the 1990s. And now formally some kind of state ownership of economic activity has been downsized, but it's still important. And it's not, we cannot say that history is in the wrong line, unidirectional. We can have turns in the history. And as we had, we are taught that the 1920s were a period of, let's say, high speculative activity and buoyance of private economy and investment and credit and some kind of golden years for business, but they finished with the Great Crisis and then the Depression, and then came the New Deal, Roosevelt and Keynes, and all the reflection on, let's say, modern economic policy and fiscal policy come from that experience. And in the post-war years, we still had, let's say, a strong influence of state intervention in the policy and state ownership in the economic activity. And then there's been another change in the counter-revolution since in the 1980s, 90s, and so on. But these are, let's say, long waves of political and rule and regimes of the. So we'll see who comes after us. We'll see what happens. Even the most conservative would admit that some minimal state should exist. Minimal state is essentially, for them, is law and order, protection of persons and property, and law enactment, enforcement, etc. But even the minimal state assuring law or order is already requires some kind of big size, because the law and order, these are the most important, perhaps, example of the so-called public goods. It's a kind of service of collective consumption in which each citizen is not rival to the others, but benefits from the fact that the state provides these services. And this requires high amounts of public expenditures, has a high fixed cost of organization, let's say, the judiciary system, so that it's not feasible for private enterprise with a short-run profit motive to run these services. Nevertheless, the purest expression and abstraction of the neoclassical theory had left no room to some kind of, to the state, to external intervention, conditioning the behavioral agent on the market. Since Adam Smith's intuition of invisible hand, we had the refining of the models of general competitive equilibrium, which refined the notion that the interaction among uncoordinated private atomistic agents only motivated by own profit and satisfaction would eventually lead to an efficient equilibrium outcome for the world economy. If the market forces, the law of demand and supply, were left free to operate with flexibility of prices and mobility, perfect flexibility, perfect mobility. So, well, there is a graph, I hope you can see it, it is small. This is some kind of notion of production possibility frontier. We can think of some kind of Robinson Crusoe economy in which there is one single man who can choose between going fishing or going searching for some potatoes and fruits in the woods. He allocates his time. According to his time allocation, you can have possibility of consuming more or less of one good or the other. And then this Homo economicus, so Robinson, has some kind of satisfaction map, and the dotted lines indicate utility levels, or levels of satisfaction. Since Homo economicus is supposed to have no satiation, so in the sense that the more is better, if we go up in the direction of the arrow, we have higher utility, satisfaction of Robinson, and we'll find some kind of point P, the maximum satisfaction given the, let's say, the technology constraints. Well, what in particular, the new neoclassical growth theories have often been tempted, is to extend this behavior, rational behavior, or these concepts defined for the micro level of the single individual agent to the whole economic system. So you can hear in the literature on economic growth about production possibility frontier for the whole set of producible goods, and a great N number and dimensional space. You can have some kind of, you can imagine some kind of frontier. And you can also imagine some kind of social welfare function, collective utility, describing levels of collective satisfaction of the populations. But this exercise by, let's say, macroeconomists, in particular by growth economists, is not rigorous, as the rigorous welfare economics acknowledges that interpersonal comparison or addition of utility or satisfaction is completely arbitrary. So if you have only two individuals, you redistribute from Friday to Robinson to Friday some fish, you cannot say that the whole of that community has gained. Someone has gained, someone has lost. The so-called Pareto criterion of optimality of ordering of situations cannot define anything. If you can say something is better, some configuration is better than another, only if someone gains and no one loses. But this is not the real cases, so that you cannot aggregate into some kind of social welfare function. If they do that, wait, they are is some kind of idealization or some kind of, oh, again, we have the stop. I try from here, then. Well, okay. The concluding result of competitive equilibrium theory are summarized in the so-called two fundamental theorems of reference economics. The first says more or less that we give an initial distribution of good of factors, capabilities among the agents, competitive mechanism of exchange, creating demand of supply, reaches always a point on this hypothetical ideal efficiency frontier. At the end of the process, we have an efficient result, but at that result is associated some kind of a vector of distribution of goods and satisfaction among the agents. And this distribution may be highly unequal. The limit we could have efficient equilibrium, which say half of the population dies of hunger. So the unrealism of the condition for perfect equilibrium should be clearly understood. Numerous atomistic agents, one agent does not behavior, one agent doesn't influence the behavior of others. Perfectly flexible prices, perfect information, perfect mobility, free entry and exit from markets. These are highly unrealistic, but however, for the believers in a competitive, in the market fight, any reform of the system which advances a step towards this ideal tip should be potentially beneficial or bettering in the position of the economy with respect to some kind of possibility frontier. So we have all the pressure, the policy for free trade, flexible labor market, free mobility of capital among states, and so on. All these kind of neoliberal policy prescriptions. And any statement about the equity results of this eventual market mechanism, this enters the domain of a value judgment, which is out of some kind of rigorous setting of positive formal economics. Sure. So you can talk about moral, or you can express your preferences, but that would be some kind of moral judgment which should be separated from scientific propositions. This is essentially, if I learned how to... Questo verde?
La rutina in basso.
No, dai. Non c'è modo di fare con il mouse?
Così. Fare
Così?
Spingere.
Up and down here. So, well, I'm speaking of the early decades of the 20th century until the 60s. Also, we had eminent neoclassical economists who were pragmatic and less radical than new neoclassical, less right-wingers. And they would admit that in the absence of ideal conditions of perfect competition, there are situations where purely private interaction among agents does not lead to a desirable result from a social point of view. So this justifies intervention, correction, regulation of trades by an external public authority. This is the literature on market failure, just to give some names. Professor Pigo in Cambridge, who was the leading figure in Cambridge in the Keynesian years, a counterpart and discussion. He wrote a textbook on welfare economics, essentially, but also Samuelson and Soro and on the other side of the Atlantic. So, of market failures, we can have micro failures, which with reference to local situations, a particular market. And we can have macro failures when the overall situation outcome of the aggregate economy is not deemed satisfactory or efficient. In premise, a situation of low activity, underutilization of resources and unemployment of labor, but also inflation, instability of prices, and cycles, and etc. So I try, that's fine. I go rather fast on micro failures. I just give some kind of cases. Monopolistic market positions, you can read, I hope they're clear enough. Public goods are those who are provided some kind of public consumption, which is, we have externalities, it's very important nowadays. Private cost is different from social cost. You can have the private cost of a steel plant in terms of consumption of raw materials and labor. But the social cost in terms of pollution of the environment are very high. Chemical plant polluting water sources in area. So you have negative production externalities, but you can also have some kind of negative consumption externalities. Congestion externalities we talk about. Traffic. Now the theme of the over tourism and how the, I don't know, Venice, Florence, and all the consequences in terms of social interaction, housing market, or so this situation in principle justify a policy action, quantitative limits, taxes, disincentives, and so on. Then we have the case of imperfect information, and the original example was that of the market of second-hand cars. You would buy a second-hand car by this man. If you don't have confidence, well, if you are silly, they will sell you a bad second-hand car at high prices. But if you are diffident, you don't buy perhaps a good car at a reasonable price. So the market transaction doesn't complete, doesn't match. But you have more important cases of incompleteness of markets, insurance, credits, health insurance to elder persons, private insurance would not profit, would lose, and will not provide insurance, health insurance to 80 years old. So this incompleteness of the market would penalize some weak section of the population. And in this case, some kind of welfare protection, collective insurance schemes organized by the state is called for. And eventually, finally, bad goods and merit goods. Consumers consume goods which we can call bad for their health or collective security. Firearms, alcohol in excess. In the meanwhile, they don't consume merit goods who would protect the individual well-being and collective security, safety belt in cars, etc. So in this case, the public policy should discourage consumption of beds and promote that of merits. Now we go to the macro failures, and here we are essentially level of activation below its potential, unemployed resources, labor in first instance, but also inflation, financial stability crisis. In this series of lectures, I think there have been other sessions on macro and money, and which have introduced to the fundamentals of the macroeconomic theory and the controversies, Keynes versus the classic scopes and limits of monetary and fiscal policy. Time in this occasion would not allow some kind of decent coverage of the topic. I would need some kind of a single session on this. So I'm selecting only for some critical issues of actual current interest. No, back. Well, in the golden years of post-war growth, some kind of Keynesian consensus prevailed, and in this Keynesian consensus, there was the targeting of monetary policy was essentially dedicated to the control of inflation and financial stability, while fiscal policy would supplement lacking shortage of private components of demand, consumption investment below potential, and not assuring a level of total aggregate demand, which would assure some kind of good activity level and low unemployment. So in that case, it was Keynesian policy would call for anti-cyclical maneuver out of the public budget, increasing public expenditure in deficit if needed, if the case, in case of stagnation, high unemployment, etc. Against this Keynesian consensus, well, there have been rounds of, let's say, conservative, liberal counter-revolution, counter-argumentations. From the first round, let's say the monetarists of the Chicago School, and from end of 1960s and 1970s in particular, Friedman at the Chicago School. And then we had even more radical neoclassicals promoting faith on the rational markets and expectations. The agents know how to regulate, they know more or less, they have a correct expectation of the working economy and adjust their behavior according to that. So equilibrium will be more easily reached. But all these counter-revolutionaries or anti-Keynesian positions targeted their attack on one key point: fiscal policy, public expenditure would not be able to change, to raise persistently the level of activation and employment of economy. They claimed always some notion of supply-side equilibrium, potential output, natural rate of unemployment. We are still well within this kind of concept. The European Union fiscal stability documents and rules always talk about potential output and gap of the actual cyclical situation from some kind of potential output, and so you should correct to towards some kind of potential output, and you have the maximum deficit allowed to the state budget given output at its potential. However, they try to measure these kind of things. So given the state of technology preference of private agent, there is some kind of equilibrium level, non-inflationary, sustainable level of activity, and the state should not move much, try to, let's say, to raise or have pretensions of going to higher levels of. So this kind of liberal mainstream, since the 1990s and in this century, perhaps seem not to have conquered the battleground and the academia and the think tanks of governments and business. It seems so, in particular, in the beginning years of the 2000s, the so-called years of tranquility. It seems that the inflation was doomed and more or less unemployment was. But how the years of tranquility ended with the subprime and general financial crisis of 2007, 2008. At that point, those who shouted for more market and less state in the 1990s, more or less, Clinton administration had more or less liberalized the banking legislation and stock market exchange legislation in the United States, giving more room for speculative activities. And then started all the cycle of overcredit and risk of debt. And at that time, the market community and everybody screamed for rescues, because we started with Lehman Brothers, but you had the risk of some kind of chain collapse of the bigger financial banks and insurance institutions. And at that point, I don't remember, but I remember some kind of $7 trillion just poured in the rescue and the refinancing of the banking insurance system in the United States. So the intervention by big state, just capable of spending, not minding deficit, because, well, they can print dollars, distribute dollars, and big bank, the big bank would rescue as creditor of last instance all situation in which a critical financial strain could raise. So these big state and big banks are the terms used by Hyman Minsky, who was the Keynesian scholar who was the greatest, I think, expert of financial market and the mechanism of debt creation, deflation, and mechanism of crisis, theory of crisis. Unless big state and big bank intervened, perhaps we could have had some kind of financial collapse triggering a real depression as in the 1950s. So already, I said, tranquil business for the states invocated, but in critical moments, still more recently, when many activities have been blockaded by the pandemics, the ordinary rules of prudential finance, sound finance, as they call balanced budget deficit not exceeding some kind of small number in percentage of GDP, are readily abandoned and the rescue by fiscal resource and monetary intervention is called for. Even in the context of European Union, the so-called rules for deficit and debt correction of the Stability and Growth Pact have been suspended between 2020 from 20 to 24. Unfortunately, we are back inside the system. They try to redefine and reimpose these rules. Oh, it doesn't work again. I have only a few points left. Okay. Well, it's time to conclude, and I would conclude with a reflection which is focused on in the context of the members of the European Monetary Union we live in. When in the 50s or 60s, main models, basic models and reflections of macro policy were elaborated, the frame of reference was that of national state with a domestic monetary authority, domestic central bank, and fiscal autonomy. We are not in that now. We have only a central bank in charge of monetary regulation for the whole of the member states of the Union. The fiscal decisions are in principle still the object of the national states' budget policies. However, the effective option for the national budgets are heavily constrained within the frame of the Stability and Growth Pact enacted by and ruled by the Union. So a country with high public debt, as the one which we are here now, incurring procedural adjustment, composing quantitative limits to expenditure or some kind of agreed path over 5 years, 7 years or so, of reduction of deficit to GDP or debt to gross domestic product ratio. So this is the case of Italy. A recent agreement a few months ago, in September, I think, with the EU Commission, defining terms of medium-term structural budget over 5 years. Within that, the nominal expenditure of central government are allowed to grow at a nominal rate, so marginally lower than the nominal rate of increase of GDP. So if nominal public expenditure increase even slightly less than nominal GDP, it means that the ratio of public expenditure on GDP is shrinking, slightly declining. So this is the provision which is desired, that the size of state should be contained or possibly declining. So if this is the medium-term constraint, I think there are no practically de facto, if these were followed effectively over the term of the policy or the policy plan, should rule out all kind of expansive policy. Well, we had, fiscal compact in the 1910s, 10 years ago. Then came the pandemic, and then everything was reshuffled and went. So we don't know what happens in the coming 5 or 6 years with this general situation, which is not that of great tranquility. Yeah? So what happens, I don't know, but if the rules work in the medium-term horizon, we have no possibility of. Well, you know, the statute of the European Central Bank is that has a single mission, that of assuring stability, monetary stability, controlling inflation. Before and even at the expense of any other target or desirable target of the macroeconomic policy, growth or employment. What is left for macroeconomic policy in this frame of the monetary union and EU regulation at this point? Either this policy are reframed and conveniently refinanced within some kind of union's context, a federal debt and federal expenditure much higher than the size of actual budget of the of Brussels. If not, textbook definitions and instructions and rules for policy about macroeconomic policy appears as unpractical, untenable, or obsolete. Well, since the interaction with historian of ancient history, I don't know how the situation of member state of, think of Italy, think of Austria, think within this monetary union rules can be reminiscent of that of satrapies or provinces within an ancient empire. Also there you had some kind of central sovereign monopoly of coinage. The vassal states or regions had some kind of fiscal or monetary autonomy, or were completely dependent on transfers and on benevolence of the central rule. How worked centralized and decentralized planning and execution of greater expenditures? Well, of course, not to say about pyramids, infrastructure, the military organization, etc. And in this sense, the experience of ancient Mesopotamian kingdoms may evocate something or some experience or some for this critical issue of governance of single nation within modern supranational entities, or like the monetary unions. It's this I have just finished. Well, there is just last one slide. It's quite obvious. We can now talk about some kind of global market failures, where some kind of unleashed market economy without control would lead society. Well, the trend is already very evident, and we are living within these trends. Increasing environmental damage, increasing inequality. Well, I call financialization. The financial market is more and more dominated by speculative trades and motives, and not by, let's say, as the service of the real activity investment, etc. So we have a risk of higher instability, higher inequality, and higher pollution and environmental change for the worse. So I think that there is much room for policies, although the single nation state perhaps has dimensions and powers which is inadequate for this range and this scale of problems. We have to deal with heavy negative externality of some kind of uncontrolled free market economy, which might threaten ecological, social, and financial welfare and sustainability and of economy and society at a global scale. And that's, I think I've kept within an hour. Thank you. Thank you for the attention.
So